beyond acknowledgement. Through our activism, we can begin to rectify Indigenous erasure and expropriation. What does it mean to teach for social justice? For 13 years, we have gathered together in this conference to reflect on that question, to learn from and to inspire each other, to share examples from our work, to think about what needs to change in the whole society for us to truly teach for social justice. Although the pandemic requires us to meet through screens, we have worked hard to maintain the spirit of this conference, participatory, engaging, and centered on justice. We invite you in the chat, in breakout rooms, and in spite of the limitations of the screen to participate, talk, laugh, question, cry, and learn, and help us bring today's conference alive with our collective humanity. Thank you for being here. The conference is sponsored by Puget Sound Rethinking Schools, the Seattle Education Association, the Washington Education Association, Social Equity Educators, the Portland Association of Teachers, the Oregon Writing Project at Lewis and Clark College, and Rethinking Schools magazine. Just a quick message on behalf of Rethinking Schools. Ordinarily, Rethinking Schools sells more books and magazines at NWTSJ than any conference during the year. Please support the publisher that supports you by going to the Rethinking Schools website and taking advantage of the conference discount to load up on social justice resources. If you have everything that you see there, buy some for teachers, buy some for parents, buy some for your neighbor. Load up. We are delighted that Chenjerai Kumanyika and Demetrius Noble, better known as D Noble, agreed to keynote this year's conference. Kumanyika is an assistant professor in Rutgers University's Department of Journalism and Media Studies. He may be best known for his brilliant work in podcasts. Kumanyika was a collaborator for Scene on Radio Season 2, Seeing White, and Season 4 on the History of American Democracy. He is a co-executive producer and co-host of Uncivil, Gimlet Media's Peabody Award-winning podcast on the Civil War, which is amazing. Please check it out. Kumanyika is also an organizer. He is on the executive committee of 215 People's Alliance and a member of the Philadelphia Debt Collective. D. Noble is an activist, teacher, and radical cultural worker. He is a professor in the African American and Diaspora Studies Department at University of North Carolina, Greensboro. His research interests include Black class antagonisms, African American literature, popular culture, and hip hop studies. His work has been published in the African American Review, the Journal of Pan-African Studies, the Journal of Black Masculinity, Works and Days, Cultural Logic, Red Wedge, and other leftist digital and print publications. They will also be leading a workshop this afternoon. Please give a warm virtual welcome to Chenjerai Kumanyika and D. Noble.
Teacher, can you help me with Common Core? I know 2 + 2 is 4, but when rent is $625 and the utility cost is another $113, and my mama hours got cut to 20 and she only makes $8.15 per hour before taxes. I don't think this math is adding up. Why is there always so much subtraction? Why can't she ever pay a whole bill? The 1st and 15th are filled with so many fractions. Teacher, why must your check be divided to pay for school supplies that the school never supplied? When it comes to our district, how come funding never gets multiplied? Remember last year when you and Miss Hyde said y'all were marching for us and wearing red for Ed? Is that kind of like what my aunt did when she said that she was marching for Breonna Taylor when those cops shot her in bed? Teacher, I think I'm confused and need a review of economics and civics. Is it Kids in cages or single moms making poverty wages, anxiously waiting on paltry stimulus checks that are gridlocked like knees on George Floyd's neck? Is this really the land of the free and the home of the brave, where food deserts are rampant for descendants of slaves? Hungry and homeless children packed tightly in Title I buildings with metal detectors and SROs on each hall, failing HVAC systems and toilet paper every other stall. Miss Jones, I know I ain't passed last year's EOG test, but that don't mean that I'm stupid and belong in ISS. I appreciate you saying that to Principal Smith. You stood up for me. I ain't mean to fail that standardized test. I didn't mean to get you fired. I really tried my best. Teacher, teacher, what's the substance of the American dream? Is it universal health care? Is it finally winning the fight for 15? Will we put an end to gentrification and stop deportations? Can we get rid of college tuition and abolish prisons, terminate student loans and evictions? Will there be universal housing? Will Black Lives Matter? Will we defund the police? Can Black trans women walk safely down our streets? Can we end rape culture, overturn this rotten two-party system, and overthrow capitalism? If the answers are yes, then teachers stand with us, because there's a war going on outside no class is safe from. Our class must win.
Woo! All right. Yes, yes, yes. That was D Noble. Man, I had to, when I was invited to come meet with you all in this place, I was like, I had to have my brother D Noble because he really brings what we need. I am so excited to be here. We are so excited to be here today. And I just got to say, it's a real pleasure. I thank you for doing what it took to bring us here, for even under these conditions to create a space where we could come together. You know, with all this social media and all the chaos and the pace of this COVID education and life, we don't often have enough time to sit here and think through complicated conversations that we need to have. So I just want to really thank you. And I want to thank all the sort of less visible aspects of the work, right? Because we know that organizing is about that work. I want to thank the interpreters, all the people who sent emails that I took too long to respond to. That we talk about what the work is, that's the work. So thank you. What Demetrius and I are going to do today is we're going to talk probably for about 35 or so minutes, and we're going to try to then have a Q&A afterwards. And then you should also know that we're going to be doing a workshop, a radical writing workshop later on. So think about your questions and let's get into it. Revolutionary education at the crossroads of race, class, and COVID. As we lay claim to the revolutionary tradition of racial justice, of survival, of collective action, one of the first things that we have to do is to accurately diagnose what we're up against. As my brother Todd Wolfson said, in a situation where you're facing a bear, what you need to know is whether you are facing a teddy bear or a grizzly bear. Because if you think that you are facing a teddy bear, but you are actually facing a grizzly bear, you will not be adequately prepared for what is headed your way. And so what's headed our way right now is an election and hopefully an end to COVID. But when Demetrius and I were talking, one of the things we noticed that there was a lot of talk about getting back to normal, right? And we heard a lot of framings of our situation as though the primary problems that we're facing are Donald Trump and COVID. And I just want to be clear here, right? I understand that when people are framing Donald Trump as our problem, they're doing that because of the situation we're in, right? You know, next week I plan to go and I'm going to be voting against Donald Trump. I'll be voting for Joe Biden, right? And I understand that when people are arguing that Trump is a primary problem for social justice, they're saying that because Trump must be defeated. And that makes sense. But I'm worried that that also sends the implication that when Trump is defeated, we will have vanquished the primary obstacle to racial justice, because that doesn't make sense. And there are those that seem to feel that when Donald Trump is defeated, we will have also defeated our primary obstacle to climate change and environmental justice. And that doesn't make sense. And there are those who seem to feel that when Donald Trump is defeated, we will have also defeated our primary obstacles to public education, patriarchy, American imperialism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, and that doesn't make sense. You can't make it make sense. And so when we turn to education, right, we're doing that in recognition that no one can participate meaningfully in life in a democracy without education. But when we want to look at the fights that teachers have been waging, is because the school arguably provides the most productive terrain for us to examine and study three things. So I want to be clear about what those three things are. The first is that schools and education help us to understand how the social ills of capitalism and white supremacy were showing up in our lives long before Trump and long before COVID. Secondly, in a context where we're told that racism is the same thing as bigotry, right? Systemic racism is reduced to acts of individual bigotry or implicit bias, right? Looking at the schools and education become a place where we can actually see, a structural analysis unfolding, right? And so that's the second thing. And then last, this has to be a story of morale, hope, and strategy. And so the schools become the most promising place to help us identify more effective ways to fight back against racial and class oppression and help us more effectively transform the material conditions that are making our workplaces, communities, and overall lives increasingly intolerable. And so what I'd like to do briefly is to take us on a tour of some of the ways that fights for public education have been leading the way. And what I want to do is I want to start off in Philadelphia, right? So starting off in Philly, right? Now, this Black woman right here is named Kendra Brooks. And Kendra is sort of public, she's a city council member right here in Philadelphia. And, as the COVID crisis started to take shape, right, and really started to get heated up in February, Kendra and other council members, Helen Gim, Jamie Gauthier, and others were really trying to understand what the racial manifestation of that was going to be. And so what they began to do was they started to look at things like eviction moratorium packages, right? Making sure that, people would not be kicked out of their homes, making sure that people had ways to pay their utilities. And they advanced that, and they really pushed that ahead of the game. And I want to be clear that that was what racial justice looked like. In fact, Kendra actually held conferences to say, what does the structural racism of COVID look like? But what a lot of people don't know about Kendra, right, is that Kendra actually started her life in politics around issues of education. She started in politics because her school was going to be shut down in North Philly. And, she actually took to the streets, took to activism, was able to keep her school open, right? And she became part of a broader coalition. We have a group in Philadelphia called Our City, Our Schools Coalition. Maybe we got some members here. And they began to understand that why were our schools suffering from, starved budgets, right? Why was control being taken away? And part of the reason was that through tax giveaways, the money that should be in our school budgets was going to some of the most wealthy developers in Philadelphia. And you know what? I just want to be clear. I'm seeing here in the chat that there's some people who are having a trouble hearing. So part of this is I'm going to slow down a little bit. It may take me a little longer, but when we go slow, we can go together. You know what I'm saying? So I want to make sure that I'm slowing down and that everybody's on board with us. So what I'm trying to say is that Kendra's leadership during the COVID era, right, her ability to recognize what structural racism was grounded in her fight around school, and part of her being a part of school battles, right? And I think that shows you some things, right? And so in Philadelphia, we began to wage those battles. But I want to move on the next stop on our tour. And for the next stop, we're going to go to West Virginia, right? So by February of 2018, teachers and other public school employees in Western Virginia had realized that the conditions they were working in were unacceptable. Their pay was 48th lowest in the United States. And then Governor Jim Justice proposed the final insult. He offered them a 2% pay raise for 2019 and a 1% pay raise for 2020 and 21, and including a freeze on benefits, right? Now, in my work, I tend to talk to a lot of people who are in philanthropy, right? And one thing you may notice about folks in philanthropy, they often will always try to offer, like certain kinds of solutions to things. They're like, oh, maybe we can innovate our way out of this. Maybe we can kind of come up with some kind of like technological solution. Maybe we can make an app or something like that, right? But, the thing about it was that in West Virginia, what they realized was that they were going to use a technological solution, but the technology they were going to dust off was an old technology, and it was an old labor technology, right? It was a radical technology. And the solution in that case was revolution, right? And so on February 22nd, right, various teachers groups called together 20,000 teachers and public school employees to strike in all 55 of West Virginia counties. And there's a long history of politicians trying to divide teachers from the rest of the working class. I don't have to tell you all that, right? They try to cast teachers as though they're only interested in their own working conditions, right? And somehow they try to position the people who are starving our budgets as advocates while teachers are the enemies, right? But the West Virginia teachers were able to avoid this in a number of ways that are instructive for our situation, right? They knew that many of the children relied on lunches, from going to school to get their lunches, right? And so one of the things they did was they made ways for actually to try to feed the children as best as they could while they were on strike, right? This is a powerful form of organizing for the common good, right? And so by using these strategies, one of the other things that happened was that they were offered a 5% raise. And I know many of you know this story. I'm seeing it coming into the chat, right? And, they just said, well, we give a 5% raise just to the teachers. Will that, quiet you down? And they said, no, you have to give that raise to all of the state employees, right? And so I think that's really instructive. And they didn't stop until James Justice signed that. Now, this doesn't mean the fight is over. And West Virginia teachers have not stopped fighting. In fact, in 2019, they went back on strike to protest the expansion of charter schools, right? But this is what we're talking about when we talk about solidarity and what it really means to fight. Now, one of the things that you have to note is that in the West Virginia strike, this wasn't necessarily authorized by everyone right away. It took a radical faction to push things to where they had to go. And I think that brings us to the next stop on our tour, which is Chicago. Now, my friend, Sarah Jaff, who's basically, Sarah Jaff is the strongest labor reporter in the country. So you should definitely read her work, right? In 2012, the Chicago Teachers Union wrote the playbook that has been successfully used by teachers around the country to reform their unions, win at the bargaining table and on the picket line, right? And we know it was the radical faction, the Congress of Radical Educators, that enacted the long-term strategy to take power in their union. And what I want to point out here, folks, again, is this was 2012 and before that, right? We were not dealing with Trump or COVID. We were actually under Obama and Rahm Emanuel at that time, right? But they still push forward, right? And, but just to kind of like dial this even more, I want to talk about a teacher named Charity Freeman. So let's bring Charity up and I'll try to get out of her way. Now, Charity Freeman is a teacher at the Kenwood Academy High School, and she teaches computer science, right? And so she's an equity fellow. And in the context of her equity fellowship, right, she was often, talking about, things like, best teaching practices. And that's really important, right? Because we want our teachers to have the best practices. But what she told Jacobin Magazine was, it doesn't make a difference if we're teaching computer science classes that don't have enough computers for students. And it doesn't make a difference if, when my students are struggling, they don't have a social worker to go to. And it doesn't make a difference if we've got hundreds of students for every school counselor, or if we can only send our students to the nurse office on Thursday, right? And so that was what brought them into the streets, right? And I just want to be clear here. Too often when we talk about racism, right, we're talking about moments of individual bigotry, right? Sometimes we talk about microaggressions. Sometimes we talk about not enough. We talk about white privilege. And those are important conversations. But what we see here in Chicago and throughout the nation is something even more pervasive. It's not enough computers, not enough mental health resources, not enough nurses and social workers. I was just talking to my brother Dennis Kasuth in Chicago, a nurse who works in the Chicago schools, about this. That is even a more kind of widespread institutional racism that we have to confront. This is a racism that's delivered by budgets under a Black mayor. And when I say racism delivered by budgets, let's be clear, this is a racism that's delivered by capitalism. And so the CTU, the SEIU, and others took to the streets, 25,000 educators and 7,500 school workers on strike. Mary Lori Lightfoot tried to preempt the strike by offering them a raise, but they rejected that and proceeded. And on the first day of the strike, they got a proposal for full-time school staff dedicated to working with students who are homeless, right? And the CTU strike didn't win everything that they fought for, but I think what they did win was instructive, right? So what they got was school communities in Chicago will have a nurse 5 days a week in every school, a social worker 5 days a week in every school, right? And then school communities on the south and west side of the city, right, predominantly Black communities, will get wraparound services they need, and they will get class limits that will go into effect first. And I think it's also important to look at how they fought, right? So the lowest wage workers in their bargaining unit got a 16% cost of living increase. As Stacey Gates said, it's really those workers, right, some of whom were under the poverty line, who are really the glue in our schools' communities, right? And we know this. And the same kinds of things happened in Los Angeles, right? And many, many other places. I know there's people from all over the country. I'm so happy to be here with you. And you know this story. You all probably know it better than me. But I just need to be clear that this is anti-racist work that we're talking about, right? Now, I want to shift gears a little bit, and I want to talk about the issue of curriculum, because no revolutionary education discussion will be complete without discussing issues of curriculum, right? The reverence for Confederate monuments and other lost cause propaganda that's being shared by current violent ethno-nationalists and high-level politicians reveals a deep commitment to an impoverished history. Many of you know me because of my podcast on Civil and Seeing White. I worked on these projects to try to explode the misconceptions and myths so many Americans have about the Civil War, race, slavery, etc., right? And thinking about what they have to do with right now. And these podcasts have been downloaded millions of times now, and I bet some educators who are listening to these have used, and I'm thankful to that, and we're really honored by that. One of the most common questions we get in response to the podcast is, why wasn't I taught this in school? And so what I want to say is this: thinking about curriculum, I think we have to think of our current curriculum as suffering from a kind of censorship, right? In every society, powerful classes, groups, individuals, right, have reasons to suppress and censor certain kinds of history. The term censored media brings to mind discrete instances of pulled news reports, banned books, films, redacted sentences on government white papers. But you can also censor whole traditions of oppression and entire legacies of resistance, like the Black radical traditions and the American labor struggle and the disability rights movement. I mean, those are conspicuously absent from our popular collective memory, even though I know that the teachers in this call right now are doing the best to bring those things into their curriculum. When histories of resistance are suppressed, they're more challenging to recover than specific incidents, right? Because even when historians and media producers are able to bring pivotal moments of revolutionary struggle to the public, they are too often cast as anomalies. Let's think for a moment about Henry Highland Garnett's speech at the National Negro Convention in 1843, in which he exhorted his enslaved brethren to arise and strike for your lives and liberties. This is in 1843 now, right? I mean, that could be understood as an anomaly, but the truth is there were countless slave rebellions before 1861 and many similar speeches at over 200 such convention meetings over 7 decades. The term censorship also makes us think about absences, right? Like absences from our curriculum and media. But those absences are hidden by presences, the presence of other kinds of histories. So histories of collective struggle and institutional racism are been replaced with compelling individual stories of achievement that allow the powerful to celebrate diversity while bolstering false narratives of American progress. When history becomes institutionalized in this way, it no longer requires the conscious or explicit ideological intention of any actor. Written into monuments, textbooks, films, flags, and the common language of broken systems or founding principles, censored history simply becomes common and revered. It celebrates white domination without racists and reproduces sexism without people who are consciously sexist, and produces ableism through people who ostensibly care about disability. With its oppressive architecture silently erected, those who would pass down that history need only follow institutional norms and paths of least resistance. But battles over curriculum are also about how teachers are assessed and who controls curriculum before Trump and COVID. And we've seen successful struggles in this. And so I wanted to bring in my brother Demetrius just to talk about some of these battles, because he has some really interesting case studies for us to think through.
Sure. Thank you, Chinch. So one example that I want to point our attention to that predates Trump and COVID takes us to Seattle in 2013, where public school teachers at Garfield High School resisted administering the measures of academic progress test called the MAPS test, right? And so why did they want to do this? This was important because Washington ranks #1 in the nation in the number of standardized tests for kindergarten through 12th grade students. The state spends more than $100 million on standardized tests, yet ranks 42nd in the nation per pupil spending. These are intolerable conditions that provoke educators in Seattle to put their livelihoods on the line. Now, it's important to note that before they took this action to boycott administering the MAPS test in 2013, teachers had been on record filing complaints against MAP testing since 2010 in union meetings to no avail. So 3 straight years, no avail. This led some rogue rank and file teachers to decide that they were not going to give the test. So upon hearing these plans, teacher activist Jesse Hagopian called a meeting for all teachers in tested subjects, reading and math, to see what actions these colleagues would be prepared to take. All of the tested subjects teachers agreed that they were not going to administer MAP tests. Thus, the issue was then brought to all teachers in an all-staff meeting because they recognized the need for solidarity even from teachers who would be insulated from not having to give the test. So when they had this all-staff meeting, teachers wanted to know what could the consequences be. And it's important to note that Seattle has a progressive discipline policy, right? And not giving a test would be classified or could be classified as insubordination, which would be grounds for termination. They recognize that this is a very, very serious decision that wasn't arrived at haphazardly. So they discussed it in the all-staff meeting to figure out what are they going to do. And then a highly respected teacher addressed the room. And this is a quote: "This flawed test is going to label my students and me as failures because it isn't testing what I'm teaching. I would rather be reprimanded for standing up for what I believe in than for sitting back and letting this test take advantage of me and my students." Upon that passionate address, a unanimous vote was decided upon to boycott the MAP testing and support the testing, the teachers not giving the test. So what becomes really instructive about this scenario is what does solidarity look like during this MAP resistance boycott campaign? The first test of the solidarity came when the superintendent Banda sent an email to every teacher in the district declaring that the MAP test was not optional and he expected everyone to perform the assigned duties. The district announced that teachers in tested subjects could face a 10-day suspension without pay for failure to administer the test. These bullying tactics only strengthened the teachers' resolve at Garfield to not issue the test. So then the superintendent tried a new tactic where he said, for all teachers that refuse to cooperate, I'm going to have the Garfield administration oversee MAP testing. This attempt and attack was designed to pit Garfield's teachers against its administration. It didn't work. The teachers maintained their focus and the administration supported them. Now, what's the next layer of solidarity? This is phenomenal. Students organized to support the teachers, passed out flyers urging their peers to opt out of MAP testing. Parents organized their own opt-out campaign. This resulted in 75% of the students carrying notes to school exempting them from the MAP test. Of the remainder, they blasted through the computer screen questions in only a few minutes, invalidating their scores. The news caught on, and in neighboring Portland, the students initiated their own boycott of the standardized oat test. This is an amazing example of solidarity where they took the curriculum into their own hands. I just want to leave with a final note because it's always really important to think about how these initial acts of organizing and solidarity prepare you for more emboldened fights. So these teachers at Garfield later become the tip of the spear's edge for the Black Lives Matter at schools protests and campaign, which later became a nationwide rallying call and fight. And in Seattle, this fight evolved for teachers to organize and push for the radical demand of an ethnic studies program, which they won in 2017. So since that time, over the last 3 years, the Ethnic Studies Task Force has been working on writing, designing, and implementing its curriculum for secondary social studies. Moreover, they also contribute to the Black Lives Matter at School website, where educators and activists from all around the country submit lessons plans and have curated a variety of classroom resources for every age group. These resources are free and they have the goal to challenge racism and oppression and provide students with the vocabulary and tools needed to take action. This is what radical organizing for curriculum looks like.
Absolutely. That was so powerful. Thank you, brother. And, just in terms of curriculum, again, I just want to say we're also going to be doing this radical writing workshop. So I know D Noble has some dope stuff for us. But I just want to turn now to our current context. In 2020, we entered a new phase of struggle with this pandemic, extremely wide-scale sickness and death, compounded with isolation, uncertainty, and tumultuous changes in our everyday lives. But while some things changed, many things continued and intensified. We see economic crises and exploitation for the poor and economic opportunity for the wealthy. As Amazon workers are still being forced to work in poorly compensated and unsafe conditions, almost 20,000 workers at Amazon became infected with COVID. Meanwhile, Oxfam reports that Jeff Bezos made so much money that he could have given all 100, and still could give all 800,000 workers a six-figure bonus, and he would still have as much money as he had before the pandemic. We also saw a continued commitment in cities across the country to police the crisis rather than to solve it. And so in May of 2020, after the killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, claustrophobic from isolation and unwilling to accept this reality, people really just took to the streets.
Inhale. Smell that righteous rage permeating from police precincts propaned with protests. I know we're in the middle of a pandemic, but I need you to pull your face mask down and smell the swell of 100,000 yells. No justice, no peace. You can literally smell the fire of our legitimate political desires whenever wind blows. You tried to hide inside, but the revolutionary aroma rolled in through busted windows. They found some rich rapping Negroes that denigrate the dark denizens who dared to remind Atlanta's black mayor that they too are citizens and are tired of living in poverty in the city that leads the nation in income inequality. With Black Lives Matter on their minds and the radical inflection point within reach, these outcasts hit the streets and told Mayor Bottoms, fuck your new Atlanta Compromise speech. Inhale. Can you smell the fear of orange monsters cringing in bunkers? See the actions of neo-fascists dispatching troops on unruly youngsters? Tear gassing our children because they have the audacity to believe that another world is possible and won't stop until it's achieved. Smell the winds of change riding in on this new breeze. Not even your offensive line can block freedom's fragrance, Drew Brees. See established budgets crumbling from our rumblings as we defund the police. See charges being filed as brilliant red fires glow. Hear the chant Black Lives Matter as global protests grow. Hear essential workers on the picket line scream, no, we won't go. Feel this mighty movement from below. Witness that this powder keg is about to blow. Take off your face mask. Open your mouth and belt suppress screams. Inhale and smell the city's on fire till you taste the kerosene. Say their names until you can taste our pain. Then join us on the front lines as we struggle for change. Don't let these embers cool, youngin'. Feed the flames.
Woo! More brilliance from brother D Noble. Thank you so much for that. I think you can check out that poem in Rampant magazine. Is that correct, brother?
That's correct.
Yes. But you know, coming back home to Philadelphia now, there is no area or site of struggle that illustrates the specific shape of inequality during the COVID time than education. And back in Philadelphia, you know, I mentioned, you know, Kendra Brooks had pushed for eviction moratoriums, right? I mean, like the shape of her advocacy, right, wasn't really only about like implicit bias. It was about these structural issues, right? And I want to be clear that first of all, teachers and educators in the Our City, Our Schools Coalition were a key part of that work to create that a sort of sanctuary, expanded forms of sanctuary. And you know, also people understood that all those battles, right, the battles to make sure people have what they need during COVID, those are education battles, right? And so in our previous fights and in the COVID era, right, what we saw was an intensification of things that already existed previously in the COVID era. And everywhere that we were looking, we faced capitalism, right? So, you know, just for example, and I just want to give you several examples. I mean, the first example here is that really coming into 2020, before we were really aware of the scale of COVID, Philadelphia was already facing a health crisis, right, in our schools. There was, you know, asbestos and lead poisoning in our schools had led to over like 11 schools were shut down, right? Meanwhile, the charter schools were not even, we don't even know if the charter schools were sufficiently tested, but that's another story about democratic accountability, right? So we already had a health crisis before the COVID crisis. Another issue that we have been fighting for in Philly was internet access, right? Because we have a real problem with digital penetration throughout the city, right? And so in the COVID era, right, we had, you know, an intensification of that battle, right? And so people actually had to take to the streets to demand that Comcast would prioritize our lives and our education over their profits, basically, right? I also want to say that, you know, we had been fighting around issues of police in our schools, and that fight continued, right? One shape that fight took was we now had to fight over the budget, right? To make sure that more money wasn't being put into the police budget and taken out of schools. But we also had to deal with, you know, issues that are a part of what Naomi Klein has called the Green New Deal, right? We would have thought like the issues of police in school wouldn't happen at home, but of course, we're having to try to confront these issues of like digital suspension, right? I know I have family members, and I know you all know this, where people are being required to be in front of their cameras, using the same mechanisms that they use for corporate surveillance, right? And then people are facing digital suspensions if they don't do that, right? So I just want to be clear that all of this is the shape of anti-racist work. And I think one thing that it really illustrates as we begin to wrap up, right, is, you know, right now the fights in Philly are about those things during COVID, right? Reimagining schools without police and this kind of surveillance. Debt Collective has become involved, and we are now trying to actually establish a public bank, because debt is personal and also structural. I mean, I just have to say this, take time to say this note. We would save huge amounts of money if we just stopped paying the interest on debt service that we have to pay on some of these municipal bonds, right? We're paying interest, which is a fictitious value that's not even going to people who don't even need the money. If we just pause that temporarily, we could fund so much. So we got to begin to understand debt and that structure, right? And how that works. And in August, there was a march for Black Lives Matter, week of action happened already, even in the COVID era, and a march for solidarity. And so all those things are addressing issues that happened that were before Trump, right? And really before COVID. And what I just kind of want to end by saying that what is required in this context for revolutionary education is a coalition and strategies that are about a bigger vision than getting back to normal, right? A more radical vision, right? To really take us into a space of radical unity and radical transformation. And with that, maybe Brother D. Noble, you can close this out.
This classroom will not be a safe space. This classroom will not be a safe space for domesticated discussions. You won't be able to say any and everything without repercussions. You are not the president, nor one of his tweets. When you speak, your voice emanates from a mouth that's attached to a body that can get shot down like Ahmaud Arbery. You are more than 140 characters. You are 25 of the 56 million potential historical actors, 56 million students disaggregated and alienated in remote satellites called home, hiding behind screens, missing football games, pep rallies, proms, and other things, posting throwback pictures of last year in crowded halls with hashtag fuck COVID-19, no doubt wondering, what does this all mean? And when can we return to normal? But what is normal? And is that something we want to return to, where 1.5 million of you return to school, but when the bell rings, they don't have a house to go home to? What is normal? And is that something we want to return to, where 16 million of you will stagger down the halls in desperate need of food? What is normal? And is that something we can even return to when every time I turn around, they're shutting down our schools? What is normal for your 1.5 million undocumented peers showing up to school every day, terrified and in tears that an ICE agent might make them disappear? And worse still, you'll never ask whatever happened to Javier. What is normal for your 14 million Black classmates forced to navigate a curriculum riddled with hate as they maneuver through crumbling buildings that are overly policed, that are pipelines to prison, not opportunities? We know normal. Normal looks like neoliberalism parading as a hero to save us from fascism. Let's redefine normal as we redefine our lives. Let's normalize students becoming radicalized. Let's normalize teachers teaching revolution. Let's normalize schools as a site where society finds solutions to the contradictions of capitalism, where class consciousness triumphs over racism, where radical feminism supplants patriarchy, where students and teachers march in lockstep to crush today's oligarchies. Let's redefine normal. Let's redefine today. Let's lean into discomfort. This classroom is not a safe space. Thank you all for the time today. We want you all to have a great conference. The next session starts at 10:15, and we'll be more than happy to entertain any questions and answers.
Woo! All right, man, Brother D. Noble. So first of all, before we go to the Q&A, I see some questions that are in here. The first thing I want to say is, D. Noble, can you give people where they can contact you? Because people are in the chat are like, where can I get this poem? Where can I get access to more of this?
Sure. Probably the easiest way is to find me on social media. at Facebook and on Instagram under Demetrius Noble. So if folks want to reach out to me there, we can begin the dialogue, and I would love to make sure that folks have these resources available to them. So Demetrius Noble on Facebook and Instagram.
And I would also say you can. I'm on Facebook. I'm also on Twitter at Catch a Tweet Down. That's a great place, and on Instagram. But mainly I want to thank you all, man. I got so much love for the people in this room, for this conference, and for these teachers who have been doing this work. I can't express enough support. And I know that probably I didn't get everything right in my presentation, but I appreciate that. So just looking at some of the questions that have come in. There's one question I really like here that said, how should educators think about their work as political education, as activism, as care work, or as all of the above? Demetrius, do you want to say some brief words about that maybe?
Uh, I love the all of the above. I think care work and activism should be bound up in a notion of political education. Um, Getting back to this notion of care work, as I referenced in some of my poems, our students are coming to us with very intense needs. And so a part of our pedagogy has to be built on this human component of caring. And that will oftentimes provide the necessary bridge in order to engage in activism and political education. That's what made the Black Panthers Free Breakfast program so important. That's why J. Edgar Hoover said it was the most dangerous initiative that they had, right? They were meeting a human need, which then provided a bridge to engage in more leftist and radical politics and analysis and action.
Absolutely. And I would build on that, kind of folding in one of the other questions in the Q&A. I understand that teachers sometimes you're in an interesting position where you don't want to be seen as pushing a political agenda, right? And and you want to be fair because we have students and families who are coming from a variety of perspectives, right? So we don't want to feel like people are going to be ostracized if they don't adhere to some kind of ideological regime. So I don't think that's what this is about. The way I think of it is, in this world right now, where you have 7 billion people, however many billion people we have on planet Earth, so many different cultures. Look at the struggles we're facing in the United States right now around inequality, right, around access to resources. If we don't have the kind of education that we're talking about today, the kind of education that I think a lot of you are involved in, you're not preparing your students for any kind of participation or leadership. So these are basic skills. And one of the reasons why I focus so much on history is because history, while we can have debates about what history is, history does eventually take us into a pool of facts, right? I believe that my histories I've done with Uncivil and Seeing White are not biased history. They're not just history to address a particular need. This is what actually happened, right? And so, we can debate about the specifics of it, but even when we're debating about history, we're already in a critical space, right, of engaging with reality. So I just want to be clear. I think that teachers, I want to help you make the case that if you're not teaching your student these things, if your students don't have a class analysis, if they don't have a racial analysis, an analysis of identity around sexuality, around trans, issues, around ability, right, and climate change, how can they participate in this democracy? You're doing them a disservice. And so anyone who's arguing against that, I feel you, but I don't feel you. That doesn't work. I see any other questions in here I want to address here. There's so many good questions coming in. See, I see some questions about charter schools. Here's an interesting question. Do you have any thoughts about how to do political education with adults in schools as well as children? Do you want to say something about that, Demetrius?
Yeah, this is a excellent question. I know in some work that we've done here in North Carolina, located in Greensboro, North Carolina. One of the things that we have thought about is how do you organize parents and what types of things can you engage in that might provide some sort of a political education for parents and their children. So one initiative that we did in particular uh, started when Colin Kaepernick began to take a knee and was protesting back in 2016 with the NFL, and that really started to emerge as an issue. And so myself and some organizing comrades was trying to figure out what can we do to support this, that just isn't like, let's not watch football. And so we created an initiative called Kickball for Kaepernick, where we met every Sunday when the games would come on and organize kickball games for children. And then we had a break where we would serve snacks, and then we engaged in a political talk with the children while the parents were there. And we extended that throughout the winter. And then once the weather cold, we turned it into this thing called Kids Collective, where we would meet at a location. We would play video games and board games for a couple hours, and then we would have another political education talk. And parents found that really meaningful, where there was like a routine place where they could go and they could begin to have these types of conversations with their kids. And these were jump off points where they could then go home and carry and continue having these types of conversations. So I say all that to say, look for those types of opportunities where you can organize outside of the school place, and present opportunities for parents to be able to begin some of this political education with their children. I think more children than we know, or parents than we know, are interested, but they don't have the tools and resources to be able to do that.
Got you. Thank you, brother. That makes so powerful. There's two questions I see that are really important I want to get in. One is about charter schools. And, the issue of charter schools is very contentious. I know that, we see this debate playing out. The only thing I want to say is I'm not an expert, and I try to be careful about speaking about things that I'm not an expert on, but I will say this. I think that it's true that every place is different, like every location is different, like school, the politics of education are not the same in every region. And so I'm not sitting here prepared to say that there's nowhere where a charter school can become a part of a solution, right? In fact, I know some charter schools, and I definitely know that many of the people I know who work in charter schools are really deeply dedicated. However, what I often find is that too many charter schools, staff, and people in leadership either don't understand or won't acknowledge a larger move to privatize public education. And they also don't attend to the specific harms and the sort of ways that charter schools sometimes create more, problematic racial regimes and assessment regimes. And, people often don't take up the issues of budgets, right? What does opening a charter mean for the budget and access and choice of everyone else? So again, I don't want to demonize people. I think it's important for us to be hard on system, but compassionate to people. And I think that some charter schools could play a role somewhere, but that can only unfold if we are real about this larger movement. And there is a movement to get rid of public education. Let's be crystal clear. So if we're not confronting that, and we're talking around that, we're not hitting. The second thing I want to say is I just want to quickly just take this other question. James Dewey asked, tell us more about the history of resistance so that American history on Black history doesn't become a litany of suffering and victimhood. This is, I think, so important. And I think it doesn't only apply to Black people, it applies to Indigenous people, it applies to women, all of these groups who have been marginalized, right? I think it's a tricky balance, right? I definitely was trying to negotiate in Uncivil. There were several moments in Uncivil where I was trying to rewrite the script because I didn't want this to become a spectacle of Black pain porn, that operates under the guise of truth telling. And so it's a tricky balance because we do live in a dominant culture which doesn't want to acknowledge some of these hard truths, and it gets real and it gets graphic, and you want to show that, but we do want to show that this is a history of struggle and resistance, and the fact that we're all here right now in this space under these conditions, that's a history of survival, that we're standing on our ancestors' backs. We're standing on them, and we're sort of like continuing. So I think some of it is like really finding those moments of agency and situating it in the right way. And I think it's so important that you raise that. Demetrius, do you see anything in the Q&A that you want to address here?
No, I like when you moderate it.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Got you. Well, I see a question here. How do you balance the sense of urgency and perfectionism, characteristics of white supremacy, by emerging white educators wanting to push anti-racist curriculum revisions and training with not rushing the process? So I think this is a person who's, a sort of BIPOC person, staff, who's supporting a white educator program, but wants to feel that momentum, but is trying to negotiate that. You have any thoughts about that, Demetrius?
Can you read the question one more time?
I don't know. I think it just sounds like, it sounds like a question about, in a group of people who seem to be committed to getting rid of white supremacy in the schools, how do we find the right pace of change that enables us to examine the questions and move forward without like staff feeling overpressured, and those kinds of things, and with the sense of people trying to get it right.
Yeah, that's an important question. And one I don't know if I have all the answers to, because I think these types of things can be very specific to the particular human dynamics of a particular location. But one thing that I would say that I think is critical is to be sensitive and intentional about having temperature checks and check-in points. How are people feeling about the work? I think oftentimes for fear of hurting people's feelings or coming off too harsh, there's a tendency to shy away from scrutiny and introspection while we're actually doing the work. And I think that's the wrong approach. I encourage folks that are organizing and trying to get it right to meet often, to do temperature checks, to say, how's it going? How are you feeling about this? Are there any things that we need to change? Things that we be doing more of, less of, start doing, stop doing? Is there anything that we're doing that's off-putting or rubbing folks the wrong way? Because it's only by making sure that you lean into those potentially uncomfortable conversations that you can make sure that you're getting right, and create opportunities for folks to move in better unison and better lockstep towards these goals and initiatives that you all want to accomplish.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And, listen, I would love to take all these questions, and hopefully we can find a space to take up more of them. I'm going to take one more question. I was going to answer a question on, I'm going to try to combine a question here. I see a question about social media and how we use it. And I see a question that I really wanted to lift up here from someone who says, I am 17 years old. I wish to work in activism too. How can I, as a child, reach out not only to other teens and adults and not have the problem of adults ignoring my information based on my age? Well, if you're watching, I just want to thank you so much for being part of it. You're already doing an important part of the work by learning and being part of this and participating and lifting your voice up. So thank you for that. And it's true, we adults sometimes don't listen in a way that we should. And that is historically, we have this kind of what's called a banking model of education, where someone like you is seen as somebody who just receives information. And we don't understand we can learn from you. So I think you're already doing some things right. I think it's important to sort of continue to learn. I would say really continue to learn, and read is really important. And, I think, ask questions. And there are movements. As a matter of fact, if you are able to reach out to Demetrius and I, there are many organizations of people your age, of students who are already political activists and making moves, right? And I would encourage you to get involved with those things, right? We're not starting from scratch. Make things, put things out, put your voice out, write things. Writing is really important. And speaking of this issue of social media, related to that question and trying to pull these threads together, one of the reasons why we're so thankful for this conference today is that our social media environment really, I think, is often not the best place to take up these issues. We try to use it as the best way we can as part of movement, and we will always continue to do that. But the reality is that, as the brother said in the poem, 140 characters can't always get it. So to youth, and in addition, anybody who's seen like The Social Dilemma understands that we call these things social media, but really what they are is corporate media, right? That is actually putting billions of dollars into shaping our brains and our habits. So I think that, we have to try to strike a balance between engaging with these media in some ways, but I'm always thinking about forms of long media. I like podcasts, which is slow. I like films. I like writing, right? A lot. And then once we write those things, we can share it during social media. But I do think we have to get outside of thinking of social media as the primary venue. In the same way with our movements, we have a lot of organizations who try to build movements purely on social media. And I think that the strongest movements and what we've seen here, what education has shown us, is that it's the fact that teachers are a base of people and parents and communities and students, right? Are communities, real people on the ground with real stakes. And that's what's driving it. And they can drive certain things in social media, but they're not relying on social media to constitute the community. So is there anything else you want to say quick to me? We're out of time, but I want to give you the last word, my brother.
Very thankful for being here. Thankful for you all organizing this forum of teachers and educators with the explicit purpose of to become better organizers, better activists, and understanding schools and teachers and education as a viable site for us to transform and change the world. Because another world is possible. We have to make it happen.
Yes, it is. All right. Well, we'll see you later. Thank you to everybody. Thanks again to this conference for bringing us. And again, the next session is at 10:15.
Yes.
So I guess we'll see each other there. But thank you all. Take care.